So we're here today with the Circle of Divine Astrology, looking at 2013 major aspects, themes and alignments. And I'm here today with my colleague Adam Smith, one of our founding members, and Theresa White, my sister. And we're being filmed by Sonal, whose inspiration and leadership actually contributed to the development of the group in the first place. So Adam, let me start with you, because you've made a major contribution in our monthly meetings at the Circle of Divine Astrology, and I know you've made some salient points which I thought I'd give you an opportunity to elaborate on.
Thanks, Anne. Looking ahead at 2013. 2013, it sounds like quite an interesting year, following hard on the heels of the famous or infamous or much anticipated 2012. It's a little bit like talking about 1067 or 1493. Seems a little bit kind of strange. And the main thing that us astrologers are looking at is the Uranus-Pluto square, the series of Uranus-Pluto squares. We've had a couple already in 2012, and then again in we've got May and October of 2013. We'll have Uranus and Pluto exactly in square. First of all at 11 degrees, and then they're going to retrograde back to 9 degrees, so within those couple of degrees, which is an interesting point in the zodiac, because that is like the 1st of January degree, which is on or about 10 degrees of Capricorn. So where a lot of countries and institutions naturally have their suns there, lots of initiatives are started for the 1st of January, so naturally that's where there's a lot of planetary activity. So where this square is going to be happening between 9 and 11 degrees, there's going to be a lot of stuff happening for very ground out, very sort of grounded, traditional, hierarchical institutions, whether it be countries, organisations, important people. So we can expect to see a lot of activity happening around that time. And this is the 3rd and 4th degree squares out of 7 Uranus-Plutos between 2012 and 2015. So we're kind of halfway through this whole cycle, which is going to be one of the defining aspects.
I'd like to elaborate on some of the points that you're making, because we're looking at the outer planets and also the natural rulerships, if you include Scorpio and Capricorn, as well as potentially the planet Mars as well being configurated in there.
Mm-hmm.
And a number of issues spring to mind, and some of which we've outlined in our regular meetings with the Circle of Divine Astrology. And that would be the issues to do with the governments, because Capricorn rules organisations and institutions.
Yeah.
But very significantly, the degree that you mention, at 9-10 degrees Capricorn, is actually using the 1801 chart of the UK, the natal position of the Sun, and on the IC as well. So we're looking at an incredibly sensitive area of the UK in terms of its home, its heartlands and its people.
Yes.
And we've already experienced 2 of the squares, and another few are being lined up for 2013 as well as 2014. And I'm looking at the unrest and the, let's say, civil disobedience issues with the empty arm of this T-square being at Cancer, and what your thoughts are on that, because the eclipses are also going to be picking up on that, which I'm sure Theresa will elaborate on.
Sure. Well, we've got Jupiter coming into Cancer in 2013, and there will be a grand trine in July 2013 between Jupiter, Saturn and Neptune. So that will be kind of quite a harmonious pattern in theory, although it is in the context of Uranus-Pluto as well. And clearly we had a lot of civil unrest in 2011. There was rioting, which was in some ways quite easy to predict. I mean, there was the government, the sort of the hierarchical, the power, the institutions and so on, versus the people who are feeling very unhappy, a lot of tension there. And Uranus in Aries, seeing direct action up from the streets, people being very sort of just feeling that kind of tension. And that fiery energy all bursting out, and we may see some more of that. My feeling is that perhaps that might be something from the past, but whether or not we see more revolutionary kind of energy, that is definitely one possibility. I think it's more just going to be a widespread change, that we're in a potentially a triple dip recession, which is reflecting the last Uranus-Pluto square, which was in the 1930s. And rather than thinking we're going to go back to how things were with the bankers running everything and everybody chasing after money, whether a lot of the changes that we're seeing on the back of 2012, a lot of the widely predicted changes are going to be a much less materialistic outlook. Whether this is too idealistic or not, I don't know. But I don't think that we're going to go back to how we were, and whether that entails a revolution or not in terms of a violent revolution, I don't know. But I do think that things are going to change very fundamentally.
What I'd like to add to that is when Jupiter goes into Cancer, it goes into exact aspect, about 10 degrees Cancer, and I think that's probably May or June next year. Mars is configurated in that pattern. Now Mars will be in its weakened in its placement there.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of that agitating the crowd and also public opinion, because we're looking at the UK chart, which if you want to focus in on that, Mars is going to be right on the midheaven of that chart. And referring back to skeletons and unearthing, I'm thinking of the natural rulerships of Scorpio and Capricorn with the Pluto sextile Saturn. Yes, yeah. I'm so sorry. So I would be very interested, because we've already looked at how the government has been exposed and the politicians and the banks.
Yes.
We're already looking at hierarchies, organisational structures, corporate bodies, whether they're for political or financial, or even churches and institutions.
I'm going to get to that.
Yes, we're going to cover. So is there anything that you'd like to extract
from that? Certainly Mars is a shorter term influence, but often the shorter term influence comes along and triggers the long term pattern. So I would say that is as a possibility. I think before the 2011 unrest that we saw, particularly in London, in a lot of UK cities, and also around Europe, there was a sense of almost that you could feel it building. I don't quite get the same feeling now, but I wouldn't discount it altogether. And certainly Mars is very combustible. But you were mentioning the church there. What we also have is Neptune in Pisces. And anybody who looks at the history of the Church of England sees that that's a very significant placement, dating right back to the Reformation, originally under Henry in the 1530s, and then in the Glorious Revolution in the 17th century, where the Catholic king was deposed. It's always been very, very influential placement, Neptune in Pisces, and we have Neptune in Pisces now, and there's a big debate going on within the Church of England. There's just been a new Archbishop of Canterbury and so on the back of women priests and gay marriage and so on, seems to be the catalyst for potentially there being disestablishment of the Church, whether that's a live issue for enough people, whether enough people care about this kind of thing. But clearly it's an example of one of the big institutions of state being transformed fundamentally, and it hasn't happened yet. But Neptune has only just moved into Pisces, and so we've got at least a decade before that potentially unfolds. And there are plenty of people within the church who are saying that that's a potential outcome. And that could be something to look out for in the context of a spiritual transformation.
This is a really interesting point that you're actually making, because transiting Neptune is actually coming to conjunct the Pluto in the UK's chart. And for me,
is that right?
Yes,
okay.
At 2 degrees Pisces.
It's another testimony then, isn't it?
And I was actually thinking of the sacrifices possible, that might be possible, or the scapegoating. And I already know that we're already looking at tremendous austerity. And let me just use the word victims of that, although I don't mean to make it in a diminished position, with people who are struggling and hard-pressed financially, who may not have any choice in terms of where they can work, because there isn't that much work because of the triple recession that we're in.
Yes.
And the people who rely on welfare, medical aid or support in some way, whether it's victim support, charities having their funding cut, and more people are expected to volunteer and work for no money at all, not even travel expenses.
Yes.
And this is a massive area of the underbelly of society, which is being, I would say, sacrificed in a way, but we do need to make the stringent cutbacks because of the profligacy of the government for many years and the bad planning of it.
Because we haven't got any money.
Yes.
It's a big point. I mean, I must admit that's I was aware of the history of Neptune in Pisces. Wasn't aware. I tend to use the 1066 chart.
Okay.
But it's an interesting point that the 1801 chart is having a Neptune return, so potentially that may give it added significance. And what Anne is saying there is right, in addition to the church, because traditionally it was always the church that provided the charity. And when there was the occupation of St Paul's back in 2010 and 11, they were a little bit slow on the uptake.
That's right.
And they eventually got on side with the people who were protesting against the cuts and against the excesses of the bankers. And eventually the church came down on the side that they traditionally always have backed, which is the underdog and the people who need the charity and the support and so on. So we'll wait and see how that plays out. But I do think that Neptune return is pretty significant when we're looking at sort of large cycles of time.
In May 2013, we actually have an eclipse at 19 Taurus, which is actually on the UK's chart on its actual Mars. So we'll have an opposition between Neptune and Mars, and with Venus in Aquarius, with the empty arm of the T-square being in Leo. But I will let Theresa.
Yes, I've just done some work in preparation by using Celestial's book on eclipses, and I've also had a quick look at Camilla Sutton's book on the nodes, crisis and redemption, and it'd be very interesting to hear what Vedic astrologers' take on the situation is, because of the precession of equinoxes. There's a slight difference in agreement between Western astrology and Vedic astrology, but generally, having looked at the theme of the last few years' eclipses and looking at the background of eclipses in the earth, air, fire and water elements, we seem to have predominantly air eclipses, eclipses and air signs over the coming year. And if you look at what the air signs generally represent, it represents the media, it represents in terms of the media, how people communicate, what the intellectual and thought processes are, and also can relate to storms in particular. I was very intrigued by looking at the recent eclipse in November in terms of America, and I haven't actually looked at the American chart exactly. Normally I would look at the Mountain Astrologer, but that was in Scorpio, and so you can think about the effect and the damage of water and the storms in particular. That was quite significant. And also in terms of the solar and lunar eclipses tend to have an immediate feel, and obviously we react more emotionally to situations, whereas the solar eclipses, depending on the length of the eclipse, for example, if it's a 2-minute eclipse, then that could actually have a shadow period of 2 years. So eclipses obviously bring change and transformation. And the other thing that I was very interested in terms of looking at the eclipses and the nodes of the moon in particular, is the conjunction of Chiron and Neptune at the moment, and how a lot of society do feel victimised. There's a loss of faith and a lack of belief of God, that people perhaps may feel they're abandoned, and that could be played out in particular by perhaps members of the gay community thinking that they're being marginalised yet again, and the Catholic Church in particular and their own faith being questioned. So that's very interesting. But with the conjunction Neptune and Chiron, it's an incredibly powerful time for transformation and accepting ourselves where we are in society in the area of woundedness.
Scorpio, which went into Scorpio at the back end of 2012 in relation to social media, Saturn clearly coming out of Libra, where everything was social media, it was all sharing, we were all opening our boundaries up, we all had a page and sharing our photographs and what we've all been up to, which is pretty miraculous in itself if you think about it. If we were all to look ahead from, say, 10 years ago that we'd all be doing this, we'd all think it's pretty remarkable. But now I think that with Saturn in Scorpio, that's going to change, and people are going to be a little bit more discerning about who and what and where they share, and all this business about our photographs and our images and everything, and our rights being potentially signed away. I think the shutters are going to come down to some degree.
May I just add something to that? Nobody actually polices the internet. The only people that police it who have a vested profit margins in it. Yeah. And I'm wondering, because quite horrible things have been happening on Facebook where people are trolled, or Facebooks are set up to actually commemorate or celebrate somebody who's actually died, but in a very unpleasant way.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether this might actually herald the age of actually limiting what actually goes on these sites and having them policed in a much more circumspect way. Because the government can't wrestle with internet law. They can't even keep up with it. It crosses boundaries.
Boundaries, that's right.
And this is one of the biggest issues. So it's like a global aspect of our society rather than ones that we can do it through our nation's borders.
It's the same thing, isn't it? People sort of say that would be a good thing, but internet freedom is also a very sort of valuable
Well, this is
principle.
Uranus and Aries, our freedom fighters.
And it's the same thing that when people are talking about having press laws, they say, well, it's actually the press who exposed a lot of this corruption in the first place.
And yet the press.
And if they weren't there to hold us to the power to account, it'd be where the big power struggles will be.
Fuels and resources.
Fuel and resources, yeah.
Water.
And in as much as over the last sort of decade and beyond, when Pluto was in Sagittarius, the power struggle was over religion. And then when it was in Scorpio, there was a lot of stuff around AIDS, a pandemic and so on.
Yeah.
And clearly Saturn in Scorpio has an impact on that, because Saturn was last in Scorpio between late 82 and 1985, when the AIDS virus was originally identified. And so it's got the Saturn return of the AIDS virus, and reflected in fashions and in music and so on, and taboo areas.
Yes.
And in politics, because that was also the time of the end of the Cold War, just prior to the end of the Cold War, where Mikhail Gorbachev first emerged, preaching glasnost, which was openness. Ironically enough, for Saturn in Scorpio, we had this guy preaching openness, and the Scorpio Soviet Union, suddenly the boundaries came down, and he started talking about sort of saying, well, hey, we've got to start talking sense here. And there was Reagan, trust but verify. And I think that there's going to be similar kind of breakthrough in terms of international relations.
Well, I think that rounds up some of the themes that we were very excited about to share with you. And we're looking forward to seeing you at our next event, which is on February the 2nd. And it's in London, in a pub called the Exmouth Arms in Starcross Street. Details of which you can find on Facebook through the Circle of Divine Astrology. And the themes that we're exploring there is medical astrology. So we'd like to invite all hypochondriacs, all people who have relatives who may have some health issues, and even ourselves, because with Capricorn and Pluto being affiliated now, for many, many years, it will have an impact on us, on our physical body in some way, shape or form, but so does old age, which is also a Capricorn thing. So we're looking forward to seeing you in early February. Do check out our websites and our Facebook. Get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Happy New Year!